Now, the rest of the story. Once upon a time, there was a French pharmacist. His name was Hippolyte Mage. He was clever indeed, but not even he realized how clever, nor could he have possibly predicted the raging controversy which he was about to inspire. For Mage, the pharmacist, was on the verge of creating a monster, a substance that would seem to addict generations to come. Hippolyte Mage was born in the autumn of 1817 in an ancient town in eastern province. He became a pharmacist while still a young man, encouraged by the fact that all of the country's great achievements in chemistry were made through the profession of pharmacy. Well, soon Mage's own discoveries were earning him awards, even recognition by the National Academy of Science. And then was offered a prize for an outstanding accomplishment in chemistry, offered by none other than Emperor Louis Napoleon III himself, and Mage was determined to win that prize. He experimented, he concocted, he blended, he discarded, he restarted, until at last in the summer of 1869, he succeeded. And on July 17, the award of Emperor Napoleon was bestowed upon him. The award of the Emperor. It seemed as such an innocuous invention at the time, and yet Mage would die in obscurity before learning the truth that, as did legendary Pandora, he had opened a box full of demons that would eventually play havoc with the world. The substance he had conjured for Napoleon could hardly be kept secret, and America discovered it in the early 1870s. As the French, the Americans were at first unaware that Mage had unleashed a monster. The rights for manufacturing the substance were acquired. Production did begin. In no time, the United States had welcomed to its economy a brand new multi-million-dollar business. Then gradually folks sobered up. Some of them got angry. Here and there, decent people demonstrated against the evil in their midst. Author Mark Twain lent his fame to the fight. There was militancy, followed by prohibition, first in New York, then in half a dozen other states, then in half a dozen more. Slowly it became a crime to manufacture, to sell, or to possess, with intent to sell, the substance wrought by a French pharmacist in 1869. By the turn of the century, both Congress and the United States Supreme Court had gotten into the act, and still the battle raged. By 1902, 32 states, 80% of the nation's population, had fallen under various versions of the ban, and the controversy continued, although after the Second World War it waned until 1970, when the last legal restrictions fell by the wayside. And yet there was an era in American history during which the French concoction was considered an evil, and was fought ferociously by the dairy industry. For as late as 1967, you were forbidden to color it yellow in Wisconsin. And as late as 1970, there were still 5 states which inappropriately, prejudicially taxed margarine. Margarine! And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Demon spread. That's what some people called margarine, that creamy, buttery substitute made primarily from vegetable oils. You see, beginning in the mid-1800s, there was a food shortage. Well, really a famine in France, which eventually led, at least in part, to the French Revolution. The French government offered a prize to anyone who could create a cheap and effective alternative to butter. As Mr. Harvey explained, a French chemist, Hippolyte Mage Moyes, invented the product in 1869. Hippolyte combined the Latin word for olive oil with the Greek word for pearl and named the product oleomargarine. It was eventually shortened down to just margarine. Margarine was patented in New York in 1871. 2 years later, the oleomargarine manufacturing company opened in New York and quickly expanded to 37 plants across the country. When margarine began hitting U.S. markets near the end of the 19th century, many consumers were already dissatisfied with the taste, quality and reliability of traditional butter. Butter was typically produced on small-scale farms, and the quality varied widely depending on the equipment, livestock, and skill of the farmer. In an article by historian Jerry Stray entitled "Oleo Wars: Wisconsin's Fight Over the Demon Spread," he argued, "So bad was the overall quality of Wisconsin butter that in Chicago markets it was known as Western grease and was sold as a lubricant, not for human consumption." Although margarine was a cheap and consistent alternative to butter, people were skeptical. At the time, margarine was a pale white color, and many people thought it was poor man's food that wasn't good enough to serve the family, and certainly not going to serve that to the guests. By the late 1880s, manufacturers began tinting margarine yellow to make it look more like butter. Margarine quickly became a benefit to consumers who saw little difference in taste and appearance and liked the spread's consistent quality and cheaper price tag. In 1881, 34 million pounds of margarine was sold in the United States. That number jumped to 126 million in 1902. Margarine was a big problem for the dairy industry. Margarine arrived just as the dairy industry in the United States was transitioning from small-scale local farms to large industrialized operations concerned with maintaining their growth and cutting out competition. With margarine threatening to replace butter, the dairy industry launched a full-scale offensive, calling into question the health and quality of margarine and attempted to police the language used to promote it. The dairy industry and its political allies attempted to stoke fears about the butter alternative, portray margarine as a fraudulent abomination that was deceiving customers, harming their health, and threatening a more traditional way of life. Governor Lucius Hubbard of Minnesota called oleomargarine and its kindred abominations, a mechanical mixture made through the ingenuity of depraved human genius. The industry claimed this lowly imitation butter was the product of tainted and unsanitary factory conditions, while carefully ignoring the fact that butter itself was often sourced from cows living in crowded, filthy stables that bred diseases. On March 16, 1884, the Rochester, New York Democrat and Chronicle published an article entitled "Poisoning for Profit," in which numerous people testified to the Senate Health Committee. Charles Moses, an oleomargarine packer, testified that his hands and feet became sore and his nails dropped out through the handling of oleomargarine. In the hospital, doctors said that if he went back to work, that it would be his death. James Gardner testified that his friend had worked for a month in an oleomargarine factory and his hands were poisoned by the margarine. He died a year later. Others testified that the sale of oleomargarine was ruinous to the dairy interest. 2 independent doctors performed tests on oleomargarine and found them to be a perfectly healthy article of food. The dairy industry began attempting to stifle plant-based dairy through regulation. It moved away from trying to change hearts and minds and instead went about trying to change state and federal legislation. New York banned margarine outright in 1884, though the New York Court of Appeals, New York Supreme Court, quickly saw through the legislation and declared it unconstitutional, arguing that the New York law was nothing but a veiled attempt to protect the dairy industry from fair competition. In Wisconsin, lawmakers passed a law which made it illegal for margarine to call itself butter and prohibited restaurants and other businesses from substituting margarine in their establishments. Wisconsin passed another law that prevented the manufacture and sale of tinted margarine, which looked too much like butter. In 1886, President Grover Cleveland signed the Oleomargarine Act into law, which imposed labeling and packaging requirements on margarine, defined as anything made in imitation or semblance of butter, as well as hefty taxes and prohibitive licensing fees on manufacturers. By 1902, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio had all banned margarine outright. 32 other states focused on making sure margarine didn't look like butter. Even with federal restriction and intense dairy industry opposition, margarine continued to thrive. Between the late 1920s and 1950s, butter consumption in the United States declined by 1/3, while margarine sales quadrupled. Throughout the Great Depression, margarine remained cheaper than butter and became a staple of many cash-strapped pantries. Margarine consumption also increased during World War II when rationing made the spread an even more appealing alternative. As margarine made its way into cookbooks, the butter substitute quickly lost its stigma as a poor man's food. Eleanor Roosevelt even appeared in a commercial for Good Luck Margarine, claiming she liked to spread it on her toast every morning. Take a look at this.
I wonder if you realize that more than 2/3 of the people in the world are underfed. I certainly wish we could find more ways to use the tremendous capacity of our American farmers to produce vast quantities of food. I'm confident that America could lead the way in helping to feed the starving people of the world. I hope that more ways can be found to send them good, nutritious foods, like the new Good Luck Margarine. Years ago, most people never dreamed of eating margarine, but times have changed. Nowadays, you can get a margarine like the new Good Luck, which really tastes delicious. That's what I've spread on my toast. Good Luck. I thoroughly enjoy it.
The margarine Mrs. Roosevelt has just recommended is new Good Luck, the light margarine. Good Luck is light in flavor, light on your tongue, and leaves no oily aftertaste.
After the federal government finally repealed its margarine tax in 1950, many states followed suit. By the 1960s, Minnesota and Wisconsin were the only holdouts. It took Wisconsin until 1967 to repeal its margarine ban, and it did so with some serious caveats. To this day in Wisconsin, restaurants are still forbidden from serving margarine instead of butter unless a customer specifically requests it. Now, it may sound crazy that there was such a big fight between butter and margarine that went all the way to the Supreme Court. But have we learned anything? The dairy industry still works hard in a battle against competition from plant-based foods. Take milk, for example. The dairy industry is fighting an ongoing battle to prevent companies from calling plant-based dairy alternatives milk. They petitioned the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to define milk as the product of hooved animals. February 2023, the FDA released draft guidance on how plant-based milk alternatives like almond milk can be labeled. The FDA allows plant-based milk to be labeled as milk because the term has been established by common usage. However, the label must clearly indicate the nutritional differences between plant-based milk and dairy milk. But you know, I bet Hippolyte Mage Moyes would never have guessed that his oleomargarine would spark such a debate between plant-based and animal-based producers, which still continues more than 150 years later. What's on your shopping list? Milk? Almond milk? Soy milk? Or some other milk alternative? Do you prefer margarine or butter? At least for now, we have the right to decide for ourselves. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.